What can the imaginary tell us about our reality? Science fiction isn't purely the realm of space and aliens, it's also very much one of the forms we use to understand the world around us, especially a world that often feels like it's changing too rapidly to comprehend. As long as there have been books, the environment has featured in writing. But over the last few years, the undeniable commingling of climate change and environmental justice writing has been reshaping science fiction in particular. Today, we sit down with one of the leading voices in contemporary science fiction to talk about the role of fiction in helping us reimagine environmental questions and how the Gulf South is the perfect place to imagine possible futures. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and the Associate Director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the Associate Director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. So today I am joined by Dr. Kelly McKisson, who is the managing editor of Studies in English Literature, which is a journal based here at Rice University. Delighted that she's going to be co-hosting this episode with us. And Jeff VanderMeer, who is our guest today, who is an author and critic who started his impressive career writing in high school. Since his early collections like The Book of Frog and The Book of Lost Places, he's become regarded as one of the leaders in the New Weird movement. His work has made him a leading figure in science fiction, and he helps us to reimagine horror, fantasy, magical realism, humor, and critically, nature. His 2014 book, Annihilation, the first in his Southern Reach series, was made into the 2018 film starring Natalie Portman, and the latest and final in the series, Absolution, is on shelves now. Jeff VanderMeer, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So, I mean, I'm going to start off and give us the kind of leading thing I was just getting at. Do we think Absolution is the final of the Southern Reach series, or?
If not, there probably would be another 10-year gap at least to think about what the next novel looks like.
That's totally fair. So to start off a little bit, I mean, your work is rooted in science fiction, and it's part of the New Weird movement, which you might want to talk a little about. But I mean, you get compared to all kinds of luminous, literary figures in history. Jorge Luis Borges with magical realism, Franz Kafka with his expressionist Kafka bizarreness, Lovecraft with cosmic horror. But throughout, I think all, or at least the majority of your work, is this real central investigation of the environment and how we think about the places in which we exist. And in these kind of speculative worlds that you're thinking about, there's this fantastic quality. And so I'm really curious about putting those things together. What does turning to the fantastical allow us to do in terms of understanding, rethinking, and imagining the places we live and the world that we're in?
I think too often, for the obvious and correct reasons, we're fairly oblivious, and I include myself, to just the daily environments that we walk through, literally. And uh, one thing I want on the kind of like mundane street level is to kind of reimagine that and make us see our surroundings perhaps in a more complex way.
Mm.
And distance is one good way of doing that. Recontextualizing is a good way of doing that. And also committing to the interiority and immersiveness of character points of view. So I always think first of like, what is this character going to see of their environment and what they're not? And so in Annihilation, for example, the biologist is very attuned to her natural surroundings and will recap in summary instead a campfire conversation that another character might remember quite vividly. And in book two, Authority, the main character, Control, doesn't know a bluebird from a heron. So, obviously that's a different kind of walking through your environment. And so that's what I really think of as I commit to the characters. And landscape doesn't really exist without that point of view. And that's really the starting place for all of it.
That's fascinating. It's reminding me of this moment early in Annihilation, where the biologist encounters this kind of fantastical moment of mushrooms that have formed into words.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great line that I will not get right, where
That's
she just
fine.
sits there and is kind of reflecting, and then is asked, what is it made of? What are the
Mm-hmm.
words? What are the letters made
Yeah.
of? Um, and she's like, "Oh, I didn't even think of this, and this is like
Yeah.
supposed
Yeah.
to be my job,"
Yeah.
and how mesmerizing that was. How
Yeah.
we get sucked in, but also what we miss when we're when it's the space or the area of our expertise sometimes that almost become blind because
Yeah.
it's so familiar to us.
Absolutely, and I think that the words on the wall are a great example, right? Because we're first trying to interpret them. We're not concerned about what they're made of.
Mm.
And so there's a lot about linguistics in these books, and words as weapons and words as something other than the meaning, but actually as a delivery system for something else. And I think that's really important too to meaningful conversations about the environment, about landscape, and and things in general. So these books do talk about the environment, but then they kind of like telescope out to a lot of other themes as well.
Yeah.
This is how I love to think of fiction, maybe not
Mm.
as a weapon, but as a
Mm-hmm.
tool, as a
Yeah, yeah,
strategy.
yeah.
And the process of defamiliarizing that you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about is maybe most notoriously aligned with science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to think of the weird and a lot of your work as operating less as a genre and more as a set of these strategies
Mm-hmm.
that can be deployed in multiple genres. Some of your work, like the second book in the trilogy, for example, is
Mm-hmm.
more thriller.
Right.
So, an example of a kind of strategy that I see a lot, maybe in your work, that I'll ask you to talk about is the kind of breakdown of the body,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe a
Mm-hmm.
strategy that's associated with horror.
Mm-hmm.
You've referred to this elsewhere as like permutations of the
Mm-hmm.
body. And I think this can be helpful in getting to the question of how your fiction talks to questions of environment,
Mm-hmm.
because a foundational kind of staple of environmental justice thinking is that we are embedded in our environments. Our
Mm-hmm.
bodies are porous
Mm-hmm.
in a way that is not always obvious to us. Do you think about this when you're writing the breakdown of bodies or characters in your books?
Absolutely. I try not to think too much of there being a divide between the landscape and the body in the books. And I think of the transformations as being benevolent in many cases. And so sometimes it's up to the reader. It's the reader's point of view that they bring to the book, whether a scene is horrific or in some ways strangely beautiful, as to also how they think about that permeation, that kind of like permeation of the body by microorganisms and everything else. Is that invasion, quote unquote, a contamination or something benevolent and symbiotic? Is it parasitic? So a lot of interpretations of my work, really depend on the eye of the observer, maybe more so on that level than for other fiction writers. I would also say that there's an affinity for me in thinking about this as a general theme or issue that occurs in a lot of different fiction. So, for example, even the idea of encountering the unknown, which I think is attached to this idea of how we see bodies, is a universal thing. I was talking to someone the other day and I realized that James Joyce's The Dead, the epiphany it ends with about the world and the snow falling, is very much something that I really recognize in my own work. And that's a work that doesn't have any speculative element at all. It's simply seeing the world for a second in a different way at the end of the story.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's fascinating too as you were talking. I mean, both thinking, especially here on the Gulf Coast, and and the various. You're from Florida. You spent most of your life in Florida
Mm-hmm.
at this point. We'll get to that in a little bit. But the things that we become very normalized, very
Mm.
familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that defamiliarization helps us to reimagine what our environments where we're living, what we might want for
Mm-hmm.
where we're living, but also in thinking actually in the kind of reverse about sometimes we're discomfortable with change to the environment.
Mm.
And I mean, there are larger examples where we can get into kind of conservation movements that get a little resistant to any kind of human interaction
Mm. Mm-hmm.
with the environment, and especially as we think about climate change, that's something that's
Mm-hmm.
becoming more important and more fraught. But even little things like our lawns, which we've talked about a good
Right,
bit on the
right.
program, that we think of, a lot of us, understandably, we're familiarized to lawns.
Mm-hmm.
We know what they look like. That is a kind of
Mm-hmm.
aesthetic which
Yeah.
we're very normalized to. And as we see movements like native lawns and
Mm-hmm.
these kind of different approaches to landscaping come
Mm-hmm.
in, that defamiliarization can meet with resistance because it
Mm-hmm.
is unfamiliar, it's strange, and there's an immediate desire to excise it. And I
Mm-hmm.
love what you're saying about that kind of notion of actually pausing and asking,
Mm-hmm.
is this a
Mm-hmm.
parasitic, harmful relationship, or
Mm-hmm.
is this actually something symbiotic and helpful?
Yeah, there are a lot of structures in our heads, and I include myself. I have to check myself and think about, how I'm viewing the landscape, how I'm thinking about these issues that, are about comfort. They're
Mm,
about reducing things down to a simpler way. And our lives are so complex and we're so inundated by the systems that kind of control us at this point that I understand that. We want to seek ritual, routine, etc. And so, mowing your lawn, for example,
mm-hmm,
having the certain, what you feel is manicured sense of order.
mm,
I can see why that is appealing, and that applies to a lot of different things. I would say it applies to ideologies. So, for
mm,
example, you'll often see someone who has a more progressive ideology, but they came from a family that maybe was in like a cult or something situation where the ideology was very rigid and very much different than that. But then they will not know to cast off the structure of that. So they'll
mm,
bring that structure to the new ideology. And so it's the same thing. And I mention that because you see that even in green energy, for example.
mm-hmm,
You'll see bringing the extractive structure of petroleum to solar, for example, and how it's implemented. And so those are the things that I think a writer can really comment on. And they are like systemic and systems based. And so you're thinking about that consciously, and then your subconscious is like, okay, how organically can I, in a way that's completely different in context, talk about what it means for someone to maintain a lawn that's actually functional and part of a dystopia, in a sense, if you think about it, but no one sees that. How do you make that manifest? And so I think that's really what you're talking about, and
mm-hmm,
how I deal with it and break it down. I think about these things consciously, and then my subconscious comes up with some street level, organic way to express that
mm.
through the way bodies transform, through the view of the landscape. So it's a very intellectual process on one level and very instinctual on another.
Something I've heard you say, and that's coming to the fore as I'm listening to you talk, is that you've always been writing about climate change.
Mm.
And I mean, you started writing in the late 80s. I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
were maybe really impressively in high school publishing short stories and
Mm-hmm.
in various magazines. I think your first anthology came out in 89.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm fascinated both by the idea that you've always been writing about climate change, but also I wonder, how has that changed? I mean, in the last 30 years, if this has been a consistent
Mm.
theme
Mm-hmm.
as what we understand and think about climate change has
Mm-hmm.
changed, how has that played out in your writing?
Well, it's interesting to me because I'm also been a fiction anthologist,
Mm,
and therefore you see the full arc of history in a way of certain themes, including the environmental themes, especially as expressed through speculative work. And it's kind of shocking to realize that people were talking about the same things back in the 70s. That you had these anthologies in the 60s where they were beginning
mm,
to almost use the word climate change. I think it was not until the 70s that you actually see it made manifest in a clear way. But you kind of see just exactly how disinformation and misinformation has worked to delay a transformation of
mm,
our thinking on this, because you could go back to those points and say, why did that not lead immediately to the kinds of actions that we're doing now?
mm,
And germane to that is my first novel, Venice Underground, which I wrote as a teenager and young adult, and didn't come out actually until 2003, I think,
wow.
grapples with that very issue. It
Mm,
assumes that we're in a climate crisis situation in the future where everything has been reduced to desert. And I don't mean desert as the kind of biodiverse place that is in the Mojave. I mean like literally desert,
yeah.
wastelands, and that we're all living in these walled cities, which have underground levels as the only way to expand. And I mention that because that was not an unusual idea by then in fiction. And so I guess the long roundabout answer to your question is, I just have gotten perhaps more radicalized in talking about it and more impatient thinking that we have wasted so much time. And that includes impatient with fiction, because I don't really want my fiction to indicate policy. I want my fiction to indicate psychological, physical states that make the reader so immersed in them that they can't not feel climate change. Because I think that's what novels do best. I don't think novels do best as being predictive. And I know that from reading fiction anthologies and seeing how many stories become out of date in dangerous ways. So that's what I've come to is novels not being predictive, but novels allowing you to live in a moment where maybe you feel this moment more acutely, and that leads you to some kind of action.
So can you talk a little bit more about, is it mood that you draw in your novels? Is it atmosphere? I mean,
Yeah.
for me, it's many things. It's setting us into that environment that is strange,
Yeah.
unfamiliar. This is a question that comes up a lot, I think, currently with eco-fiction. Is
Yeah.
like, do we want a mood that is dystopian, that is desolation, that is despair? Or does fiction owe a reader, a student, a voter,
Yeah.
something with more hope or possibility?
Right.
We talked a little bit about how your work places a reader in different places emotionally. But where do you sit on this? I think there's a lot of folks writing in the climate space too now. I think of Mary Heglar writing from the South about, hope can come later, action is first,
Yeah.
right? What do you hope that your readers take away, or what's the kind of dominant mood, or
Yeah.
talk about this a little bit?
I try to get away from hope versus despair, because I feel like it's more about practicality. We have a list of policies and things we know we need to do. And those can seem depressing to people, but they're not, because if they're the right policies and they're the right things to do, they're actually an expression of hope. And so where I get exasperated is people wanting an artificial hope that actually is disastrous, because what it means is we're not actually dealing with the issue. It's a kind of deflection or distraction to think about those issues that way. So I really respond to what you said, that person, what you quoted, because it feels real to me. And the real danger in fiction is providing a fantasy. And that's why I mentioned the policy thing, because even just recently, without mentioning a novel, there was a novel that purported to provide policy, and people are beginning to see the chinks in the armor of that. And it's very distracting to have a novel pretend to do policy, and then people go down a rabbit hole following that or thinking it's authoritative. So I would go with that. I would also say that it's really important that we have novels from different points of view than, say, my own straight white male perspective. And so I mentioned, one of my favorite novels is Michelle T's Black Wave, which deals with things from a queer perspective of just trying to make a living in, I believe, San Francisco while climate change is occurring. And so it's a real street level vibe in it that gets away from this kind of themes being in the forefront, which sometimes can make a novel seem like a person with all of their internal organs on the outside. It's just not the way a novel's supposed to be. But that lived-in experience of this queer community in San Francisco is much more meaningful to me as a reader than a novel that basically says, "I love trees." It just is. It's more lived in. It's more human. So that's kind of where I come down on it. As for my own work, I just really want people to get lost in the interiority of the characters, and whatever they find there with regard to climate crisis is what I hope they get out of it. I will say this, that Annihilation in particular has led to a lot of people coming up to me and saying, I became a biologist because of this book, or I went into environmental science. And so that very real effect is something that is very humbling, flattering, and something that has made me less cynical about what fiction can do. So.
I think it is one of those common experiences with artists. We hope our work
Right.
goes on and has meaning,
Right.
and those tangible moments are
Right.
really gratifying.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
To Kelly's point, and something that you said in that really eloquent response, you mentioned you don't want to provide a fantasy, which is so fascinating for someone whose work is so fantastic.
I understand the contradiction.
No, I mean there's a contradiction, I guess, but also I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's like fantasy actually allows us to put some limits on things in ways, to understand where our own limits are, maybe in a way that allows us to reimagine that rather than a kind of policy. Yeah.
Right. I mean, what I would say is that the ecstatic visions, the surreal elements are in service of the real.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. One thing that was really intensely interesting to me is when, and I know he's a cliche now, but when I first came to Salvador Dali's work, kind of a complete jerk as it turns out, but he his work itself, the surrealism, or Leonora Carrington sometimes, the effect is created, the surreal effect is created by a series of small, realistic brushstrokes that form an image that is surreal. And I think that was really important to me as a fiction writer, because the fact of the matter is that my books deal with the real as much as they do the uncanny. So a book like Annihilation is 85% real details about the world and then 15% eruptions of the uncanny. And so what I am doing is I am showing the reader a real place, and I am giving them real details, because the other thing about these books, including Absolution, is every detail of the natural world or the human world that is not uncanny is something that I have experienced directly. And that's very important to me, is that the grounding of the surreal is in something that is ultra real. It is autobiographical. It is something I have experienced on a tactile level. And I think that's what allows the fantasy, so to speak, to work. And that's why also, if they have anything to say about climate change or climate, environment, it's because they're grounded in actual places.
Something else that I think that I find really rewarding in your work, and I know a number of colleagues of mine, and I've assigned some short stories before, but my colleagues have given full books that you've written, and the students, I think, really, they can fly through it, they enjoy it, it's work they really seem to resonate with. And some of that is, as we talk about climate change, we talk about eco-anxiety a lot on the show. I don't want audiences to just hear some of our discussion and think, oh, this is really heavy and hard, like
Right.
climate
No,
work,
no.
because yeah, the structures you use, the horror, the fantastical, also the humor. There's so much humor that runs across your work. It is incredibly engaging. And so I'm really kind of fascinated by that in particular, if you want to highlight the importance of that.
Yeah, the importance of humor is it's huge, because first of all, humor is not a throwaway thing. Usually, when if you look at any most stand-up comedians' work, even they're dealing with very serious issues sometimes, and they're using humor to mediate it or to understand it, analyze it, and do so from a perspective that you can't get to without the humor. The other thing for me as a novelist, is speaking to your point, is that the issue of hope or despair is often mediated through what the tone of the book is. So for me, a book like The Road is much less effective because it is completely in one tone. And I learned this writing fantasy, the first series I did, set in an imaginary city, which was I could have very dire things happening, but it was relieved by the energy and the brightness and the fantastical elements of the city itself. And in The Southern Reach, humor is very prevalent. I mean, I would argue that there's humor in Annihilation, just in the way the biologist deprioritizes human conversation, so you literally get this summary of a campfire kind of dismissively conversation, and then she goes on to describing an owl or something. I think that's very funny. Or even the conversations about the tower tunnel. There's an undercurrent of absurdist humor there. And it's even more so in Authority, which is like a dystopian workplace, but has these elements of, like, someone asking you if you want to see a strange room and you having to respond to that. That's absurd. That's surreal. It's funny. And in Absolution, I would say there's even more of that. Sometimes in the camaraderie between two central agents, the secret agency, and in more overtly in the third section with this guy on this expedition high on these anti-anxiety drugs. But it's really important. In Born, it's even more important, a novel where you have this kind of relationship between biotech and a human being, a child-mother relationship in a way. And seeing those moments they're also in moments of emergency. So it's why you hear about ER doctors and nurses joking around, because they're trying to make sense of a terrible thing, and they're not trying to make fun of anyone, but they're trying to make sense of their situation and cope, right? So.
Absolutely.
There could be a lot of care and tenderness, I think, in some of the things you write too.
Yeah.
So there's almost a romance plot in the Southern Reach trilogy, although I like the way that it's not a typical romance plot, right?
Yeah,
Care comes between characters in ways that are maybe not typical, or that we don't normally look for.
Yeah, and that's what I look for too, is what is unusual in the relationship. So in Absolution, there's a friendship between an older man and a younger woman that never is going to devolve into a romance, because it would be a terrible idea, but also because I thought it'd be really interesting to just show this friendship and how it evolves, and despite the fact that they're very different. And and the same thing in the other books. There is an element of love expressed, whether it's just the love of friendship, just in quotes, or it's something more romantic, as in Born. And so that's another thing that I think doesn't get talked about enough with regard to my books, is there's this element of love there present in every single one, and care that I work very hard on, and I think is really, again, why the uncanny elements work, because why should you care otherwise? Even for characters that are alienated. But you see them trying really hard, right? You see them trying hard, even if they're alienated, even if you don't necessarily love everything about them. You can understand them, and you can understand how difficult it is to work when you are compromised in your agency and whatnot. So.
We haven't talked yet much about the setting of much of your recent work in a fictional U.S. Gulf, or its relationship to the Gulf. And I sense that you care very much about the U.S. Gulf and this place in North Florida. Do you want to talk a little bit about this place and the Gulf, its setting for your book, or maybe for your work? I know that you have a new nonprofit in North Florida. Do you want to talk about any of that?
Well, I think that it is a unique area. It's like the seventh most biodiverse place in the U.S., which means it's also high up there in terms of the world. It's not very well known. We have the largest freshwater spring in the world, Wakulla Springs, and it's not even like a UNESCO heritage site or anything. It's just like taken very much for granted. And that particular part of the coast is a place where you will not have Wi-Fi reception. Your phone will not work. You will be on a dirt road where you don't know where you are without a map. And I think that's fairly unusual. It's a place you can actually get lost. And it can't get built up too much, although developers are now sadly trying, because so much of it is state and federally protected land. So it's in this unique situation where it's more permanent than a lot of places. And I know that's unusual, and I know I have a real privilege in being able to experience that, because that's not the state of the world right now. But it is something that I think has been very influential in my work in general, in terms of like grounding me, and this permanence, this sense of permanence with this underlying thing of human intervention. So I just did this Globe and Mail editorial where I talked about how we don't really understand places anymore, because we don't understand the intersection of the human and nature, so to speak. Nature and culture have been confused because we've built so many places that are now in ruins, like abandoned mines that might be actually biodiversity hotspots now that we plan to like repurpose, but in doing so we're going to destroy something because we just see the ruin, we don't see what's built up around it. And my point there is that even like that stretch of the coast, like Wakulla County, just has like tons of septic tanks just waiting to more or less explode. Pardon me for saying that, but it has all kinds of environmental degradation issues going on, even with the biodiversity. So I think that contradiction in my subconscious is very powerful, and something that I think about a lot, that you can have a place that's beautiful and biodiverse, but also not only under threat, but just like literally it coexists with this other stuff,
I mean, that actually reminds me of an episode we just had on a couple of weeks ago, where we were talking about the conversion of former oil rigs into coral reefs. And I mean, just the way that those two things can go together. And I think that's something really fascinating that runs across your work, and probably something, directly from this fascinating place that we're from, of the Gulf Coast, where there are so many places where nature and man collide in interesting ways, and ways that sometimes, back to our earlier point, I think we find jarring or uncomfortable, but also provide unexpected opportunity.
Yeah, and if I could get in a plug for a book, I would say that Christopher Brown's A Natural History of Vacant Lots, or Empty Lots, maybe I think it's called, which is, he lives outside of Austin, is an amazing book about this very subject, about these liminal spaces that are neither nature nor culture, but some combination of the two. And their histories are very fraught. But there are often the places now, especially given how much we've intervened in the world, that are very meaningful, even if they're forgotten or misunderstood. And so that's something that's also beginning to permeate the work. And there's some of it in Absolution, but it's probably going to be more prevalent going forward.
I mean, it's something that's interesting to me. I've heard you say the BP oil spill was very influential on your work when you were writing. And I also, there's a line, and I think it's a line other folks have asked you about as well. It's an excellent line from Annihilation, of desolation tries to colonize you. And I think putting those two things together a little bit, but the U.S. Deep South has historically been the space of colonization, both the national colonization, but also in more modern times, kinds of acts of colonization by corporate interests,
Right.
by the country ongoing in ways that we see a
Mm.
lot of wealth literally leave the region and not get recouped. And I'm curious about, yeah, I mean, as a Gulf Southerner, as a native Gulf
Yeah.
Southerner reading your work, there are
Yeah.
so many things I do find deeply resonant.
Mm-hmm.
And also in mercurial ways, maybe
Mm-hmm.
that humor, that feeling of mixing of humor and desolation, of
Mm-hmm.
fantastical and improbable, and also if you've been in a swamp, it
Yeah.
does. There's something terrifying and
Yeah.
magical at the same time.
There's two things that occur to me. Like the desolation line's really more about like what do we think desolation is in that context, because it's actually not desolate. It just simply looks to a human being desolate. Yeah, but it also makes me think, that line, of how we live with scarcity today. And I give as an example often Terrence Malick's movie The New World, which gets some things right, some things wrong in general, but has to be shot in our modern world. So if
Can
you
you
look
just
at,
give us the quickest kind of idea of what that film is about for
yeah,
those who
it's
aren't familiar?
basically about the first contact between indigenous people and colonizers in North America. And what it does as propaganda, unfortunately, is what a lot of films do. It cannot show you the wealth of wildlife in that era because it doesn't exist anymore. So you get scenes that are actually empty of life. And if you actually go back to journal entries from that time and everything, you'll get descriptions of like, I cannot see the sky for the flocks of birds.
Yeah.
And so we are colonized again, or contaminated with this idea just from the media around us, that the world was always this way,
Yeah.
and we can't see it properly. So that's the other thing that occurs to me when you say that. And then with regard to the South, it's interesting. In the first three books, I chose Southern city names that I made up, so I could like get the history in there, but I didn't have the responsibility of knowing the true history because that wasn't important to what I was trying to do. But I still wanted to like be right to the spirit of it. In these books, the places are real, so I felt more of a responsibility. So my research assistant, Andy Marlowe, I said, I want you to map every setting that I have to environmental important sites, if they are, to colonial, to pre-colonial, to indigenous, to African American burial sites, which can be fraught because sometimes there's no markers, right? They've been destroyed, except that the graves are still there. And what they found was shocking. There was no database of these overlays. There was no way to put together a unified history of place.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention that is that this is important to me. It's important to me to know down to the geological time layer what a setting has been. It may not enter the scene, but if I know it, I feel like there's a haunting of the scene by it. And so it could just be two people talking about the weather or chatting in a very, surface way. I still need to know that information. And it was shocking to me that for North Florida, that doesn't exist for the public. So our Google map that I have to then give over to somebody like at our nonprofit to see if there's some social justice angle or something interesting here for the public to know. It's still, I still can't get my head around it.
I mean, that's so fascinating. What you're talking about resonates very deeply with me. We've had folks on the show before, and also my own work involves a lot of indigenous research, and so these accounts you're talking about, which are so vivid.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that the history you're mentioning there is so critical because you're right. I mean, certainly those kind of early colonial encounters, they're just thick with description of exactly these kinds of the wealth of.
Yeah.
We've talked about this on the past in the show, but the idea that a couple of centuries ago, the Gulf Coast was much more protected from storms by just these
Exactly.
armies of oysters.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
these things where,
yeah.
you'd have accounts of people navigating into the bayous and channels and saying, like, we were in a horrific storm, it was blowing the ship asunder, and we got past this barrier of oysters, and it was calm. Like we could suddenly navigate because of the wealth of what's there. And even hearing, not at that level, but very similar kind of accounts of just a century ago, how much more there was. And that human scale knowledge doesn't allow us to account for this. I'm fascinated by that. And I'm fascinated by your research process. And I wonder, I'm so impressed you have a
Mm-hmm.
designated research associate for your work.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about both your research
Mm-hmm.
process, but also, yeah, how it does
Sure.
inform this work?
Yeah, no, everything that you just said, by the way, resonates with me too. It makes a lot of sense. I think usually with research, what I do is a novel is a long process for me. It gestates for a while. I can write a novel too soon, but never too late. So I get very relaxed about it. And so I do the research. I get a sense of being able to do the research, pretty early in the process and then forgetting it. And then whatever I remember is what I will put in the novel. And I think that's a good way of doing it because I do think as a novelist, you can feel I put this time into this. I need to use it. And a lot of times you don't. You just need like a little bit. But for this novel, the whole structure came to me in my head and the characters on July 31st of last year. And I wrote in kind of like an ecstatic, altered state through December 31st and had a finished final draft. So that means
Wow.
that it's 150,000 words. I wrote about 400,000 words to get there. But the point of that is that I realized in a panic that unlike Annihilation, where the research was the hiking I had done for 14 years, that I had actual research that needed to be done, but that if I stopped to do it, I would lose the music in my head. Like I could see the progressions of the scenes. I could hear it. I could know when the rhythm was off, and I knew that if I stopped writing, I wouldn't get that rhythm back. So I asked an FSU professor, could you give me a name for a research assistant, which I'd never used before? And they said Andy Marlowe. Little did I know Andy Marlowe was the most decorated FSU undergrad in their history in English and the arts. And this helped a
Wow.
lot because not only did they do the research I talked about and researched into the CIA in the 70s, they wound up translating Schubert lyrics for me from the German when I needed them and also created art that's in the book, in addition to other tasks that were more like collaboration.
Wow.
So I lucked out entirely. And so, like, for example, when I said, well, now I need Schubert lyrics as if an alligator wrote them because it's actually kind of a central hypnosis technique, they said, sure. So there
Wow.
was that kind of thing where I really lucked out with his research assistant, and it was much more of a collaboration in some ways than I'd expected, and it worked out great.
What a phenomenal opportunity for an undergrad.
Right, right. We even did an interview for Bomb Magazine about the process because it was
Wow.
so different than my usual.
That's fascinating.
Is your research process, as I hear you talk about it, and the many versions of
Mm-hmm.
collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
I also see that in some of how at least the Southern Reach
Mm-hmm.
series is put together
Yeah.
with the kind of layers of mediation.
Yeah.
There's notebooks through which readers
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
There's kind of the narration by the narrator,
Yeah.
but then there's other accounts of
Yeah.
these histories, maybe
Yeah.
vernacular knowledge.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in whether that's true, my
Yeah.
reading of like how this research process
Mm-hmm.
applies to then how you shape the
Mm-hmm.
fiction, but also about the status of different knowledge systems.
Yeah.
Like science is
Yeah.
a big
Yeah.
structure in the novel.
Yeah.
The CIA or
Right.
information sciences, but then also this very strange seance society that may be based on real history and research that you've done.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and redirect me if I forget part of the answer. I would say that I have become more collaborative and more relaxed in the novels, and I think it started with Hummingbird Salamander in part, where I had a biologist create the fake hummingbird and salamander, and made a rule where I had to react to that what they came up with and not change any part of it, which created a lot of interesting narrative constraint that changed the story in useful ways. And so there's been more and more of that, as opposed to when you come to the systems, I am obsessive in mining out things myself. So when you become obsessive about something, you can also then express it in an obsessive, maybe excessive way, that maybe gets a little bit farther because you're not necessarily concerned with accuracy. You're concerned with the novel being a laboratory into which you can enter interesting ideas and things about systems and have a conversation about it. Even philosophy, when I study it, I like to sometimes distort it in the novels and have a character that you maybe don't like be the one to express an idea you like to kind of make you think about the idea differently. So, that's part of it. And then the second part of your question was about, sorry.
This maybe the status of science or the
Oh,
status
yes.
of seance or pseudoscience or
Yeah.
vernacular
I have
traditions.
a friend, Layla, who has given me an interesting idea about science because she was like, we often misapply science to the wrong situations. And what she meant was we have different systems for different things. We have philosophy, we have religion, and we have science. And we confuse what they're good for is when we come into conflict sometimes. And so, I also grew up with my dad's lab, USDA Fire Ant Lab in Gainesville, Florida, and it was so clear to me that the idea of bias in science is so important to discuss without denigrating scientists who do a lot of amazing work, like in the climate change space. But I would see people append their names to papers for no reason other than power struggles and research deformed by those power struggles. And so, and I've also, gone on like owl banding volunteer program things where it's kind of ritualistic and it's clear they have no real purpose. They've just done this for decades, and it's a ritualistic thing, almost like it's out of a Thomas Ligotti story. And so you have to question everything. And so in the novels and also in Absolution, I question what it means when like you're a specialist, because when you're a specialist, sometimes you're interpreting everything through that viewpoint and you can't see the other things. So like in Absolution, they're specialists, so they're trying to interpret why these rabbits are eating fiddler crabs. They're not asking the wider question of like, should we get the hell out of here? Because they're scientists, and this is, they've been studying the fiddler crab, so this is just another, expression of the fiddler crab research, so to speak. So there's also some humor in that, and I don't really want to bash science. I just want to look at that interesting thing that there's a human bias in everything and what that means. And not to go on too far, but it was like shocking to me, even the most basic thing of realizing, oh, the human egg is seen as this passive thing and the sperm as active because a bunch of male scientists came up with this. And that reduced down the actual complex way in which those two things interact to something that's not true,
Yeah.
So that's really important to me to think about that.
I like that you multiply science, right? At least that's one way I might think about when we enter Annihilation. There are, a handful of characters, and they're all a science discipline. Right. So we don't get just one monolithic science, but multiple ways in. All of the characters are also all women. So I did want to ask you a question about why write women characters, and maybe especially in the eco-fiction space.
Well, I think that I had the initial, words from the wall in a dream, famously, woke up and had the first 10 pages in my head and wrote them down. And at that point, they were just their function. I didn't have names for them. And I just had dental surgery, and so I just went back to sleep. I had 4 teeth pulled, and it was like horrific, and I was kind of in an altered state. But anyway,
so are you about to recommend to everyone that if they want to be a great
well,
writer, they need to
that's
get on
the joke I
Laughing
make.
Gas, or...
Sometimes a beginning student in a workshop will ask the question of, they ask questions of things that are not within their control, and one of the questions is, how do I become a New York Times bestseller? Which there's so many things wrong with that question in the first place. And I say, well, have dental surgery, be in an altered state, remember some words in your dream, and then write a novel that you don't remember in 6 weeks.
I'm not sure I can pass that on to my students.
I know, exactly. It's not replicatable. Nothing about my career is really replicatable. But
that always is the story, though, isn't it?
The craft is, I think, but not the career. But what were we talking about again? Because the question... Women characters, yes. So then I ask myself, what do I not like? Sometimes I ask, what do I not like in these kinds of situations? And whether it's movies, TV, or books, I don't like it when there's some token woman. And especially in movies, what you see is she's obviously often dressed differently. She's treated differently by the script. She's often one of the first people, along with a person of color, to die on an expedition. And so, I just put that in the back of my head. And the very next day I woke up, and I had those characters in my head, and they were all women. So it's kind of like a conscious, subconscious impulse thing. And at that point, I said to myself, well, how do I want to depict them? They're already their function. Do I give them names? And every time I tried to give them names, they resisted to the point of I knew them less well. The distance helped me. And then I was like, am I going to describe them? And I was like, no, I'm not going to describe them for 2 reasons, because that's the usual approach. I want them to be defined by what they say and what they do. And then I also thought, well, that also makes the landscape around them literally be more words than the descriptions of them. And so it creates this kind of claustrophobic effect where the landscape and the characters merge more on the page, literally on a paragraph sentence level. And then it also gave me this amazing opportunity to then describe some of them in the second book and give them names and give them a history, right? So people build up this image of who they are in the first book, and then at the very beginning of Authority, as part of the destabilization process, oh, they're not all white women. A lot of people default to their 4 white women in the wilderness, and then they find out they're not. And I think that creates a really powerful effect. It destabilizing, makes you think about your assumptions, and was an interesting opportunity then in Authority to do other things that kind of expand on the characters and make you see them differently in other ways.
We're coming to the end of our time, unfortunately. But I do want to give you a chance to talk a little about the Sunshine State Biodiversity Group, which is the nonprofit that you're with, and if you want to tell us a little about your work with them.
Well, I mean, kind of going back to what I said about there not being a huge overlay of information in North Florida, there's not a lot of environmental education. We could have leaned into things like ecotourism, and we have not. And maybe it's just simply we have so much federal protected land, we kind of felt we didn't need to, but we really need to. And this was kind of reinforced by going to the Georgia coast. And yeah, some of their environmental education is because they have very rich people living on some of those islands. But, you know, it's still like amazing. It's amazing what you can learn about the environment there. So we're leaning heavily into environmental education. We're funding and hoping to create a system where we fund youth groups so that they get to see some of the really important parts of North Florida and kind of like learn early on about the environment in interesting ways. We are doing some land conservation, but it's very expensive. So we're basically providing the education part. We would be the ones providing the signage and things. And that may seem like a small thing, but when you've gone to a wetlands and you've seen a sign that is apologetic and defeatist, you'll realize how important that messaging is. And also it doesn't usually include an indigenous perspective. So integrating all of that, the signage is really important. You know, it is how people perceive the landscape in a public space where you go down a boardwalk or something. So those two things, educating the youth and providing that kind of environmental education is really our focus right now.
No, that's valuable work. All right, so as we're at the tail end here, I do want to ask the question that I love to ask authors of what are you reading or what have you recently read that you'd like to shout out?
I think Naomi Klein's Doppelgangers is an amazing book because it's about the current moment and being confused with another Naomi who kind of went off the rails and had a mind virus basically that took her over, and now she's like spouting all kinds of counterfactual stuff. But it's also really about doppelgangers in general. So I'm doing that thing I do, you know, in Absolution, there's themes of abandonment that came from examining ghosting, which is a more modern phenomenon, and other things like that. But here, what I'm doing is I'm basically reading it to distill down the doppelganger element, which is very important in my work and also in Absolution. And finding that although it's a very topical book, that she does have to grapple with this whole idea of doubling and what that's meant historically in fiction and other things. So I'm having a lot of fun with that book, even though it's also terrifying what she kind of went through. But it's a very fascinating, layered book.
Jeff VanderMeer is the author of over 16 books, the latest of which is Absolution, part of the Southern Reach series. It is available everywhere books are sold. Jeff VanderMeer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for a thoughtful conversation.
Now we'll go to our researcher, Sophia Soltes, who has another in her Critter Corner series.
Hi everyone, it's Sophia, and welcome back to Critter Corner, where we dive into Houston's fascinating wildlife. In each episode, we feature experts and enthusiasts who share their favorite local animals or plants, the roles in our ecosystem, and ways we can all support our community's biodiversity. For the second episode of this series, we will be talking to Della Barbado, Director of Education at the Native Prairies Association of Texas. Welcome to the show, Della.
Thanks, Sophia.
Of course. To start off, can you tell me a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
As you mentioned, I'm Director of Education for Native Prairies, and I am very lucky that there is a remnant prairie here in the Houston area, which is very rare. Less than 1% of remnant prairies exist across the United States, but also in the coastal prairie ecosystem. So remnant just means that it's never been plowed and it's never been developed. So the genetics that are there have been there for thousands of years, like up to 15,000 years. So I get to teach at Deer Park Prairie, where there are over 370 native species of plants. Swallow that for a minute. And so I do student field trips out there, teacher workshops. I was just out there yesterday with a group of high school students collecting some of the Houston critters that we're going to talk about. And I also do classroom presentations and adult tours.
Della, thank you so much for coming on. We're so happy to have you. So now that we know you a bit better, we're here to talk about your favorite local species. Can you tell us about what species you'll be talking about today and why it's special to you?
Absolutely. My favorite species, and I'm sorry to say there's more than one, the swallowtail butterflies. So many people choose the monarchs or even the Gulf fritillary, which you should plant passion vine for, but the swallowtails are larger, they're local, they are beautiful butterflies. So there are the giant, the black, and the pipe vine swallowtail that I would love for your people to Google.
We'll make sure to do that. Could you tell me a bit about what role this species plays in Houston's ecosystem?
Well, they, as all butterflies do, they have a life cycle of 4, different stages. The adult lays the egg, which turns into the caterpillar, which eats the host plant. And then that turns into the beautiful adult butterfly. And for me, I mean, the role of the butterfly, beauty for us, but they don't care about that. So it's just, I mean, as far as any species, the human, factor doesn't really matter to them, right? So they just want to exist. That's their role, just to exist. And so if we plant those host plants, which I would love to list, then we can ensure that they will continue to exist. So without the host plants, the swallowtails do not exist.
Yeah, well, we'll get to some ways that people can support this butterfly in a second, but before that, what's one surprising fact about this butterfly that people might not know?
Surprising fact about this butterfly, they're huge, they're bright colors, they're gorgeous. They have, the black swallowtail has little blue dots. And the other swallowtails are just as gorgeous. They have different shapes. And to me, it's just their surprising fact is just their beautiful, brilliant colors and their beauty.
Yeah. And is the swallowtail butterfly a type of butterfly that you can see in the downtown Houston area, like in more of a cityscape, or are they just on the prairie?
If people plant their host plants, then they will come. It's kind of like that saying, if you build it, they will come. The adult butterflies can travel up to a mile to find their host plants, but when they lay that egg, then the next adult, after, all the stages, can find the next one. So what we need is some contiguous planting of the host plants.
Yeah.
And if that happened, then absolutely they can go downtown.
Yeah, for sure. And perfectly leading off of that point, what are some simple ways people can support the swallowtail butterfly?
Planting the host plant is absolutely key because the adults can drink nectar from many, many, many native plants. And I'm not even going to list those because there are so many, but the adult can only lay her egg. The caterpillar can only eat the host plant. So for the giant swallowtail, that is a citrus tree. Now, the native citrus tree is trifoliate orange, and that has beautiful, wonderful smelling flowers. I mean, if you've never smelled an orange flower, it's absolutely wonderful. And the Hercules club tree is also a host plant. For the black swallowtail, prairie parsley is the really good native plant, but also anything in the carrot family. So fennel and dill. So, if you see caterpillars on your carrot plant, please don't kill it. It's not a pest. It's a beautiful thing that's going to turn into a butterfly. And I'm going to say that about caterpillars everywhere. They are necessary to create their life cycle, and they are necessary for the birds to eat. So please don't kill caterpillars. Pipe vine swallowtail, you want to plant some pipe vines, the woolly Dutchmans pipevine is native to this area. And then for the Gulf fritillary butterfly, plant passion vine. It's absolutely a gorgeous flower to add to your patio or yard.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Della. It's been such a pleasure to learn about the swallowtail butterfly and how important it is to local ecosystems.
Thank you, Sophia.
For everyone listening, make sure to check out some of the host plants that Della mentioned if you would like to see more of these large butterflies around your home. We will be back soon with another episode of Critter Corner, and thank you for listening.
Finally, Sophia will tell you how to get involved this week.
Hi everyone, it's Sophia, and I'm coming to you today with some great ways to get involved in the Houston area with environmental initiatives this week. First up, have you ever wondered how we keep track of Texas bird populations or wanted to get up close and personal with some of our local wildlife? If so, please consider joining the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory for a bird banding event on Saturday, November 16th at 8 a.m. You will be working alongside licensed bird banders Robert and Kay Lookingbill to band captured birds before releasing them. In participating in this event, you will be directly contributing to increasing knowledge about the migration patterns of birds in our great state. More information can be found on the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory website. On a different note, if you've ever wanted to create a little piece of farmland right in the heart of Houston, now's your chance. At the Houston Urban Gardeners Monthly Talk on Monday, November 11th at 6:30 p.m., you'll discover how to cultivate your own food right here in the city. With insights from local farmers, you'll learn practical tips for growing fruit trees and edible native plants, making it easier than ever to turn your backyard or balcony into a garden. Make sure to check out the Houston Urban Gardeners Facebook page or website for additional details about this event. If this idea piqued your interest, and you just have to get more gardening action this week, then I've got good news for you. Come volunteer at the Houston Botanic Garden on Wednesday the 13th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. to plant seasonal plant plugs for winter. Not only will you be lending a hand to beautify this garden, but you'll also learn valuable tips for winter planting from garden staff. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week with more ways to get involved with environmental initiatives in the Houston area.
If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. And if you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, original music by Carter Dean, research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce, Sophia Soltez, and Naman Rinstor. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.